Hello, everyone. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue. It's Dina from Sport Law Strategy Group and hanging out this afternoon with Steve. We're really excited to be offering these conversation matters as an opportunity to stay connected because normally we're hanging out with you in boardrooms across the country, and given that we're still in a pandemic, this is our way of connecting with all of you and making sure that we're still able to be responsive and connected as a community. So a couple of things. We're on today's format. We're just waiting for more of you to join. I think we've got, what, 20 or 30 people registered, Steve, about that? So we would love to just open it up to conversations with you. What are some of the questions that are weighing on you? What are you curious about? How do you want to use, this platform basically to help you either answer a question that that you're curious about, or there may be something else that you just, you want to share. So we're going to warm up with Steve. I'm going to be asking him what's been going on. But before we do, and we're just going to wait a few more minutes here to give everybody a chance to join, we're going to ask you how you're feeling today. And one of the, I'll walk us through the different kind of experiences, but are you feeling, code red, where you're feeling like maybe angry, frustrated, overwhelmed? Are you feeling yellow, where you've got lots going on, maybe a little bit anxious, but you've got in a full plate, but you're feeling somewhat energized? Green is kind of like calm, everything's in order, I feel organized. And then blue is maybe feeling a bit sad, like the weight of the world is weighing on you. So we just want to get a sense of what's the energy of the people that are joining us today. So we'll give you a moment to kind of check in and just let us know how you're doing. We're going to launch the poll. There you go. Thanks, Steve. Okay. So a lot of you are in the red zone today. And then some of you are in the blue. Yeah. Okay, let's give a few others some time to inviting all of you to answer if you can, so we get more than just the 65% that have voted. Give us a sense of how you're doing. Red, yellow, green, or blue, and then we'll close. Just give it a few more seconds there, Steve. I see people are still joining. Okay, so why don't we close it, Steve? We're at almost 100%. So the vast majority of you, 36%, are feeling a little sad and depressed. There are the results. There we go. So we've got a number of you that are feeling maybe the weight of the world, and a reminder, just because you're carrying it so well doesn't mean it isn't heavy. So hopefully today can be, Steve, that's an invitation for us to maybe slow our pace, meet our clients where they're at, maybe also explain or share with them some of the stuff that might be weighing us down too, so they see how we're dealing with stuff. Quite a few of you also are probably feeling frustrated and angry and like completely over the top. So we can maybe address, hopefully some of what we share today helps you go from red to a different state. Hopefully it's not the reverse. And then those of you who are green, an invitation to be sharing maybe some of the good practices. What are you doing to keep you in the green? So just an open question for you as we go through today. What are some of the healthy healing coping strategies, and an invitation for you to get that in the chat box so that we can start to connect as a community and maybe take care of each other a little bit more. So thank you so much for playing with us. We're probably going to, keep this as a practice just so that Steve and I can kind of shift our energy to meet you where you're at. If you were all in the green, we would just kind of turn it over to you and say, what are you doing to make to feel so comfortable and healthy right now. So thanks. And for those of you who just joined, we just did a little quick check-in. This tool is going to be shared with you in the handouts. It is a phenomenal tool to use with your team as a quick check-in to say, hey, human being, how are you doing in this moment? So thanks for playing. Appreciate that. So Steve, why don't we start with you? Why don't we, what's on the burner for you? And first of all, what color are you right now?
Oh, I feel like the rainbow. Actually, this is interesting enough an opportunity to take a breath and really just chat. So thank you everybody for attending to allow us to do that with you. It's really busy and it's a little mind-boggling every day, Dean. I guess I count our blessings to say that we still have employment, and then in some respects I feel bad because most sport isn't even operating these days. So it's a bit of a catch-22. What's happening in my world is a lot of strategic direction thinking. People are working because there's no, possibly because there is no on-field sport happening around most of the country, particularly here in Ontario. Organizations have taken the time to start looking at the things they usually don't have time to do, like governance, like their policies, like educational pieces, trying to bring their districts and clubs and regions up to speed. But one of the most interesting topics that I've been dealing with the last couple of weeks is trans inclusion. It has started to come up again as a topic, and it's really been an interesting learning curve. You know, as CCES spent a lot of time a couple of years ago drafting a policy to, the intent, of course, was to create an inclusive environment, and what we're finding out through the implementation of it, it is and it isn't. And we're now seeing some organizations take the perspective of, if you are a trans athlete, you can register in the gender of your choice, rather than saying, well, you identify as male, you have to play with the males. There's a lot of social, emotional side that is now being considered in this area. So really, really interesting to be learning about the learnings that we've had over the last couple years on this particular issue. So that's a huge hot topic for me, and really seeing what different sports have done with respect to, again, as normal, we're all over the place. Some have implemented legacy clauses for trans athletes. Others have said, just register where you feel comfortable. And others have gone, again, that more traditional route of you must play where you identify, but maybe not necessarily recognizing the 15 years that an athlete may have played identified as a woman, and what that would mean at the age of 19, 20, 21, 22 to now move from the women's locker room to the men's locker room as a trans athlete. So that's really been something I've spent a fair bit of time with a couple clients on the last couple weeks. The safe sport movement is still very, very vibrant, from policy implementation and also education. We want sport to be able to manage complaints or safe sport issues in-house. So we're spending a lot of time creating guides and resources to help people do that, as well as, of course, comply particularly at the national level, with the integration of the UCC by April 1st. So that time is coming really quickly. And then the last thing I'll speak about, well, two more things I'll speak about, is governance. Doing a lot of bylaws, and I kind of laughed at myself all the time, because when I started doing this 19 years ago, I said, well, how many bylaws can you write? And the answer is a lot. So people are taking advantage of the downtime to look at their governance structure, trying to think about things a little bit differently. And that's been, I've got quite a few of those projects on the go. And lastly, I'll speak about is education and slash COVID. You know, last year, 2020, we spent a lot of time on COVID related matters, and that slowed down a bit. But now what's happening is, as we get back to sport, and particularly those at a national level are having to make decisions about whether they're going to send a team to Mexico or Brazil or Europe in still a COVID environment, and what is the risk that the NSO is prepared to assume on behalf of its members. And a lot of these people, a lot of these decisions relate to Olympic qualification. So it's a very delicate, complicated situation where an NSO is saying, do I send my entire, IST team to Mexico so our athletes have the best chance to make the Olympics? Or do I not do that and we don't sanction the travel? Or do we just let the athletes go on their own because we don't want to assume the risk? It's really complicated, and organizations are starting to have to learn really quickly about travel risk assessments and whether we send a team to whether we send a team, and no matter where in this world, with respect to a pandemic, still very much not in control. So that's really what's keeping me busy these days. And email and just talking to clients is still very prominent. So not bored, lots going on, and yeah, I actually am enjoying this hour to kind of take a breath to chat. So thanks everybody again. You're muted,
It's
Dina.
yeah, I'm on mute. I think that's the word of 2020. You're on mute. Oh, thanks, Steve. So there's a couple of things I'm just going to ping off, and then an invitation to all of you to ask some questions. So is there anything that you're burning to ask the lawyer in the room? And then maybe some of what I've been tracking and some of the newer or interesting projects that have been coming my way. I'm happy to share some of the trends and the themes that I'm seeing. So on risk management, just to underscore what Steve just shared with you. So we have a full travel risk management policy and implementation guide that includes the hand guide for the athletes, a hand guide for parents, a hand guide for team members. So a really thoughtful and progressive, approach to when are we traveling, where are we going, what is our tolerance for risk, what are the practices of the host country, what are the standards of care. So there's a lot for us to unpack there, and we had all of this ready to go pre-pandemic, and we kind of paused, Steve, because of the pandemic and now the particular sensitivities around that. So if anybody's curious about the work that we're doing there, you can connect with our colleague, team member Jason Robinson, who's kind of taking over the whole risk management file that I've been leading for about 15 years, and he's going to be the king of all things risk management. So you can certainly connect with Jason, and he'll be happy to share what he knows about that. On the trans inclusion and the safe sport, and let's start to connect around our commitments to EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, Steve. And so if we actually take a giant step back and ask ourselves, who are we? So what's the purpose of the organization? What are our core values? What do we stand for? And what's our ethos, our philosophy? I'm finding that a lot of organizations are in a better position to make sense of all these commitments. And then they can go back to policies that they may have made 3, 4, or 5 years ago that now actually feel insufficient to meet the requirements and maybe the moral necessities, imperatives of 2021. So in the spirit of, how do we untangle all the transgendered issues and Black Lives Matter and post Me Too and some of the safe sport, you can feel the intersectionality around all of that. Our first place to start is a conversation around the values. And if you start there, our sense is you're going to get a lot further, a lot quicker than if you start from, well, how do we minimize risk? So I'll pause there, Steve, and see if you have any comments about that.
It's definitely coming up in the conversation. So the clients that I'm working with on this issue have put together a inclusion committee, a trans inclusion committee specifically on this particular topic, and that the values-based decision making is definitely part of the conversation and running through scenarios. And if you apply the generic inclusion policy that's out there, basically we say to everybody, you can play wherever you want to except for cisgender men. And you say, well, okay, wait a second, now I have to take a step back, and well, how is that fair? And then looking at the social, emotional side of a trans athlete is also becoming prevalent. As we said before, well, okay, we're happy to support you. You're identifying as a man. You're more than welcome to play with the men, and vice versa. But again, the social emotional side and the conversations that are happening is that, well, what is it like for a trans male to be in a locker room of 19, 20, 21-year-olds after they've played their entire 15-year career with the women? So what does that look like? And then of course conversations start, and makes me cringe when we start talking about separate locker rooms and how do we manage this? And really that's not what we want. We want to be inclusive as possible. So the values-based discussion is for sure happening, as well as running through different scenarios of competitive versus recreational, and what will our stakeholders think. And to be honest with you, my opinion is, what will our stakeholders think? I'm not sure I care. And what I mean by that is, if a parent is going to be upset that there's a trans athlete playing against their child, um, the arguments of safety, they're all over the place. If you're a 6'2" woman and you're playing against at 14, and you're playing against women of the same, or girls of the same nature, you have an advantage. So a lot of these arguments are not, they're one-offs, and those one-offs exist in our cisgender anyway. So when I play basketball against a 6'10" individual, yes, I do think that's unfair, but it's unfair, but because it's their advantage.
You got to work harder.
Absolutely, or stretch myself out more, but I don't think that's a lot of value in the decision-making process. I've written a lot of policy in sport for the last 20 years, and I do find that we routinely create rules and regulations that sometimes prohibit people from playing, and really that's not what we want. I understand the politics and all our kids are going pro and they're going to make $1 million and get scholarships. I understand that mentality. But at the end of the day, we really just want people to play, and to play for life, and to have good experiences. I say this all the time. Me personally, sport has been almost everything to me as a individual growing up in a small town in Nova Scotia. That's what I did. Just played sports, year round, all day, every day, and had my parents put floodlights in the backyard so we could stay out late, and then was able to compete at a high level as an athlete. Now sport has given me an opportunity to be a professional. So all of these things have been very positive, and I want, of course, the same thing for my kids, whether they're gay, straight, plus, trans, whatever. I want them to be able to have a positive experience, and I really like that approach. I know it's sometimes simple, Dina, for you and I particularly. We tell people what to do or how to do it, but actually implementing it does become a bit more challenging, and I recognize that. But I want people to have good experience, because truthfully, the number of Olympians that the number of people who are at a high performance level in most sports across the country, 1%, less than 1%.
Yeah, that's a great noticing, Steve, and maybe that's a beautiful segue around perspective taking. So this hour allows us to kind of pause as a community and ask ourselves, what do we see? What don't we see? What are the societal expectations? What are the trends in the industry? What are we seeing outside of Canada? What are the expectations of the next generation? And, as someone who's been doing quite a bit of research, I also have a living lab with a 21-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 15-year-old living in my house right now. So, so it allows us to take perspective, which I really appreciate, Steve. And if we allow that, most of the athletes that are young people in communities across our country, while they might have dreams of being a Paralympian or an Olympian, chances are they're not going to make it that far. So what is the point of sport? And that brings us back to our values. So if our values tell us that we want to be inclusive, then how are we showing up in an inclusive way, in an open way, such as athletes who are transgendered feel like they can continue to be a part of a community that probably they've been a part of and could possibly be a lifeline for them while they're going through some of the bigger life transitions. So I really appreciate that, Steve. And I also think sport has really has to press pause and ask itself, in the context of 21st century, in 2021, we tend to discriminate, and we use age and we use gender to be able to discriminate, maybe skill as well, right? So we have rules and policies to say, well, men go here and women go there, the traditional way of organizing sport. And then we also have a mixed or a co-ed experience. The same is true around age, right? So in community sport, we say if you are 14, you're going to play with other 14-year-olds. So I think for us to be really mindful moving forward around having that perspective of what is the intention of community sport, for instance, and when does it really matter from a fairness perspective for us to start to put in place rules, regulations, policies to safeguard the experience for more people. Maybe it's only at the international level. And that's kind of sort of where Canadian sport organizations are now, right?
Well, I actually had this committee call last night, so very fresh in my mind, and that was one of the options. We had come up with 5 or 6 options: legacy clause, co-ed option, um, open registration, and the third one was a non-age gender-based grouping of athletes. Now, to your point, Dina, how is sport set up? You're a 12-year-old girl, you play here. You're a 14-year-old boy, you play here. And when you start applying the human rights code and saying, are we making decisions based on age and gender?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a walking human rights complaint from the beginning. And a conversation did come up last night. Well, let's scrap the whole system, and we're going to have category A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. And depending on your skill and your emotional intelligence, we would put you in your particular category. So if you were a 6'8", 14-year-old, you might be in the B division, and your peers are in the E division.
Right.
And everybody on the call actually said, that would be, and actually the word you like to use, Dina, did come up, Sportopia did come up. And of course, everyone kind of had a little bit of a laugh saying, they'll be dead by the time that actually happens. Because it would really undercut the whole premise of how we operate sport in this country, and not just this country, in the world. Again, if you're we go to the Olympic Games or the Paralympic Games, you're a woman, you play here. You're a man, you play here. And if you're a transgendered athlete, you must fit within the doping guidelines to play here. And don't get me started about the Castor case, because that's a whole other discussion. So it was really interesting to have the conversation, but really apprehension to change the way we do things because of the political landscape behind it. But it definitely came up in discussion, and I think the comment was baby steps.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And setting our intention, right? So what does good look like? What does great look like? And if we're really going to be open and inclusive, the definition of open and inclusive 10 years ago, we might say it's changed. Right? And so how progressive do we want to be? How inclusive do we want to be? How fast can we reasonably go? What's the organizing structure right now in sport? Who's going to be first amongst equals? I'm really always curious about who's more ready than others. And we have the newer, more emerging sports who said, doesn't matter if you're female or male, come and play. Right? So, or somewhere in between. So I do think we're going to see a lot of shift, and the pandemic is, I think, forcing some of our worldviews and the assumptions that we have around how we're organized. And I do think that's actually a healthy thing, right? For us to ask ourselves, is this actually the best way that we can organize moving forward?
Some sports, Dina, have already started saying, for argument's sake, U14 is co-ed. There is no boys, there's no girls. At up to the age of 14, you play with your peers. And I know other organizations have started at the U8 level, and their plan is to facilitate it through in some respects. So there's a slight movement in that direction. I mean, I always kind of make the joke if the IOC were to change it, that would make our lives a lot easier, but not sure that'll happen anytime
Let's see if we can influence the IOC. How's your color coded now, Steve?
Yeah, exactly. Getting anxiety is increasing, but yeah.
Great. Well, I love the thread of Sportopia. So if we go there, maybe one of the things that is making my heart sing, Steve always chuckles when I say that, is the work I'm doing around with some clients around cultural transformation. So one of the things that is happening right now in the pandemic is the staff of national offices, provincial offices are really missing the touch points. They're feeling disconnected from each other. So we're experiencing this staff with staff, board and staff, staff and coaches. So one of the ways that we've been working with clients on investing in, and Steve called it, you know, the emotional intelligence, my capacity to self-regulate, to name my emotions, to be with my emotions, to communicate in a way that's really mindful and values-based, is the use of a little tool, and I kind of showed it here earlier, called the Nova Profile. And you know what I love about the Nova, so first, as a parent, I've used it with my 3 children, and it has been actually extraordinary. It's like they're walking around with a little dashboard, and I can see, you know, what is their personality type. I know that I might be more expressive as a personality type, and so that's how I love to engage with people. But if I'm in the presence of someone who's more introverted, needs time and space to be able to digest the information, would prefer to receive information in advance, have time to read it, do not want to be surprised with a creative, hey, what do you think? Without them having time to think it through. What that does is it helps us, when you use a psychometric tool like this, you start to do this. You go from walking around unawake and unaware and maybe a little less emotionally intelligent, Steve, to this. You can see your profile in shades of colors. And then I get to see Steve, and I know what Steve's colors are. So I can kind of show up in a conversation, and I have to do the hard work to kind of meet Steve where he's at. And then the most important thing for me when I work with organizations is we color code the situation that's bringing us together. So Steve and I, you know, we've had to collaborate on a few big things the last little bit. And, you know, normally we call each other and we're like, hey, how are you? How was the weekend? Well, sometimes it's, hey, Steve, code red. So we don't have time to warm up, right, and say, how are you? So just being able to understand what's this color of the situation that's bringing us together. So I'm really excited about that. On the other side of the spectrum, Steve, I've been doing a lot of crisis management, and there's some people back at our shop that have been supporting me and me them. I would say that there's a number of little issues, and I think it would be a great little thread for us to explore. I keep looking and hoping that some of you are going to be asking questions. So please ask questions, because we want to engage you, but until we see questions, it's, you know, we don't want to just not say anything. So just let us know if you've got a question, just pop it up there, and I'm keeping an eye on that. So crisis management. So everything under the sun is coming up now, and where I would really love to take the conversation, Steve, is on this continuum of interpersonal conflict that we've been playing with. And there's a blog building in me. So you're getting a sneak preview. So here's a way of understanding the story. So Steve and I internally, we're calling ourselves Dina now. So on Steve's side of the fence is all the legal stuff, right? And Steve was talking about complaint management and how do we do better in that realm. On my side of the house, we talk about the human factors, right? The more humanistic approaches, and how do we get people to play better together? So when Steve's world collides with my world, in the middle is what we're calling, you know, unnecessary conflict. So on my side, on the far right, we have generative tension. And that's the work that myself and the other integral coaches, and you know this to be true with athletes and coaches, right? Or athletes and coaches, and that partnership, the spark that allows them to produce extraordinary performance. And I see, Steve, that there's a comment here from Trevor, so maybe you can take it in while I continue. So on this continuum, we have the human potential, and coaches right now are feeling really concerned. A lot of the coaches that we're working with are concerned about how far do I push? What is actually safe? How do I get an athlete to achieve their full potential if I'm not sure I can actually give them a hug? Maybe I inadvertently cause them offense. Like, it is a deeply concerning world right now, especially for the coaches. I think they're feeling deeply, deeply uncertain. And then if in a pandemic, especially, we're not nurturing the relationships between each other, we get into this, what Steve and I call this mushy middle of unnecessary conflict. Now, anybody who's moving from generative tension, where extraordinary performance occurs, into that mushy middle will tell you this: the only ways that they feel that they can resolve this is to leave the organization or trigger a complaint. And once you're in Steve's side of the territory, it gets really hard, even if it's actually not complaint worthy. Steve recommends that people do coaching or they do emotional intelligence work. By the time people have gone through this, it might take 3 months, 6 months. We've dealt with situations that are a year. It is almost impossible for people to come back into my territory and start working in generative tension land. Why? Because they have to actually put their egos aside. They have to do this move and acknowledge their contribution to where they got stuck in the relationship. That's why I love this tool, because it's getting all of this stuff out in the commons, Steve, for us to work better together, for us to acknowledge that we're contributing to some of the tension, and then to kind of own our communication preferences and challenge ourselves to communicate more effectively. So I don't know if you have anything to offer around that, Steve, and then we can maybe bridge to Trevor's question.
Yeah, like it's interesting, Dina, the number of complaints that have come in hasn't slowed down, and I again find that a bit mind-boggling because we're not necessarily on the field or we're not at full capacity, but starting to understand different ways to manage complaints is super important. As you know, we've had some pretty good success on bringing in coaches on mediations rather than bringing in lawyers, depending on what the desired outcome is. So I do think being strategic is really important, and looking at the underlying catalyst of the complaint, or is maybe it's not even a complaint, but people fundamentally still want to be heard and they want you to care. And a lot of times that's an educational piece to members. I did a webinar yesterday for a PSO to try and educate their case managers on how to manage complaints. And that was one of the comments that we spoke about was, people want to be heard, they want you to care, but they also expect you to be sometimes everything. And that's not necessarily what we can offer, particularly depending on the capacity we have within each organization, which actually, Dina, is a good segue. We're gonna flip roles here because this could be a question for Dina. Trevor brings up a really good question, and it's about equity and diversity and values and policies. So, from my perspective, Trevor, and this is where Dina and I do work well, is the yin and yang. Yes, I think policies are fundamental. Not just EDI policies, but any policy. It provides you a guide. It provides direction on how to manage an issue. It also defers potential conflict or bias. This is not a decision that Steve Indig made. This was a decision the board of directors made 6 years ago, and we're implementing that policy. Now, when we talk about it through the lens of an EDI, having a trans inclusion or an inclusion policy or an EDI policy is probably about, I'll say, 30%. To your question, and this is where I'm going to pass it to you, Dina, how do they live those values and how do they live those policies is really what Trevor's asking. So I think it's a two-part answer, Trevor. Do you need policies? I think absolutely. But how do we, Dina, how do we live those policies?
Okay, well, thank you for that. Thanks for the question, Trevor. We often get that. So it's what's really amazing now, Stephen. You'll recognize this. So having the policy is foundation. Then what you're speaking to, Trevor, is policy plus. So what is the strategy that we're going to commit to? So think of policies. The way I speak about policies is I think of them as promises. Here's our promise. We're going to commit to being more inclusive as an organization. Okay, great. How are you going to do that? So the policy plus allows us to be more mindful and strategic about how we're going to make those policies live. And then the next layer up from that, Trevor, is cultural transformation work and engagement. So one of the big things that we're pushing right now, especially as it relates to safe sport, and it's been true for, I've been in sport almost 30 years, so I would say it's been true for as long as I've been in sport, but we're seeing it more present now. It's the engagement of athletes. If it's true that you'll hear lots of people say this needs to be athlete centered. Okay, great. So if it's athlete centered, how do you know whether or not the athletes feel they are at the center of the experience? that they feel it's safe, that they feel included. And then in particular, because you've raised EDI issues, you know, one of our team members is doing quite a bit of work in this area around BIPOC, so Black and Indigenous people of color. And what we're discovering there is it's really important to not, you know, from speaking as a white cisgendered woman, for me to make assumptions that just because it's safe for me, that it's safe for all women. So what I can say is my experience, which is context specific, might feel it's safe, but the same coach might have a different relationship, and an athlete have a very different relationship with that coach. So I think what we're working towards is having committees of volunteers who are enacting those strategies, makes an explicit commitment that your policies are actually coming to life, which means ideally in a Sportopia kind of world, you won't have to trigger the policy, because you'll be actively engaging your people in the implementation of the strategies that express your commitment to live your values. So I'm going to give you some really tangible things. So if we're really inclusive, we're going to make sure that our photos, the pictures we use to promote our sport, have BIPOC pictures in them. So pictures of Black and Indigenous athletes, for instance, that we have athletes with disabilities that are showcased in the expression of our sport. That we're going to make it, for instance, in our signature line, maybe you have a she, her, they, so that athletes who are transgendered or, you know, LGBTQ will see in your signature line, this might be a safe place for me to, you know, contact this person because I see that they are open, you know, and maybe inclusive. So there's lots of ways and great practices that we can use to express our commitment. Another one, and I'm going to apologize here because normally now more and more I'm opening up sessions like this with an Indigenous welcome. And what that means basically is just a land acknowledgement. So take a moment now and acknowledge the likely unceded territory upon which this conversation is being held. So as you can see, Steve, I'm pretty passionate about some of these things. And the questions really is, what is the proof? You know, what would give people reason to believe that your policy is actually being honored? And if you use it from that lens, then I think it becomes a little bit of a easier way to implement your commitment.
On the inclusion committee I was working with last night, there is a transgender consultant, and he's been excellent. It's a transgender male, and he's been excellent. And I actually asked him, I said, are you offended the fact that there's a trans inclusion policy? And he said, no, I think that this is something that's necessary right now to support education and to support choice. He said, but I hope, you know, making dates up 5 years or 10 years from now, we no longer require that. And I thought that was a great statement. A secondary question came in, Dina. Two more questions came in. Thank you, everybody. One particularly was about, you know, trying to support their athletes within the organization to support Black Lives Matter and the legal ramifications of that. I mean, again, I really probably would suggest the legal risk side of that is fairly low, particularly if you're moving for a positive change. So I don't think there's a long answer here. I think it depends on what you want to do to support your athletes and to support the Black Lives Matters movement. But I don't see a severe risk, particularly legally. And I, to be honest with you, I don't see one politically either. I think there is this is very much socially acceptable in today's environment to be supporting.
Yeah, Steve, can I just offer? Yeah, on that one. So I would agree. And I would say that from our learnings, our team member, so I'll share two quick stories. So one of our integral coaches who is white, who identifies as white, actually sought out, this is before we had Mel on our team, sought out a Black man to host a conversation with Black athletes. And so she came in as more of a kind of a neutral guide for the conversation, but really wanted the subject matter expert to be a Black person, and that really mattered to the athletes. They wanted to be guided by someone who they could maybe relate to more. So I think that's an important consideration, asking the people that you're there to serve what matters to you, and then trying to walk the talk with respect to our inclusion commitments. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And Dina, I'm laughing to myself because we have had clients who have established inclusion committees that happen to be all white people.
Yeah.
So you do have to be a bit strategic on your composition of the committee. So I do recommend that. A
Well, and
little,
on that
go ahead.
note, like here's the other, so let's take another inclusion topic, equity. So, and we won't name names, but we know of situations where female coaches, for instance, that are you're hoping to choose a coach of your next women's team, and the committee is all male. So you just want to be able to defend your decisions, is what you're hearing from Steve and I. And when you press pause and you ask yourself, does this reflect our values? What are the risks if we're an all-male committee selecting a coach for the national team? And then what are the risks if we don't invite a woman, or, and are more inclusive if we're walking the talk, especially given it's, hashtag 2021. So being able to pause and gain perspective, I think, is what we're inviting all of us to do, eh, Steve?
Oh, totally, totally. And the second, Marvin, I'll come back to your question on some COVID related conversation, but to Michael's second part of his questions about maybe separating legal structures from a foundation from your actual business. Again, I mean, I think it's something to consider, and Michael brings up charitable status. That's something very difficult to do in particularly at a provincial or local level as a sport organization. If your mandate is simply that of a charitable ground, you could get charitable status, which means really you have the ability to provide tax receipts for the donations you receive. But that might be a little bit different about segregating the deliverables of each entity. One might be to provide basketball programming, and the other one might be to lobby or advocate on behalf of a particular movement on behalf of your stakeholders. I think that's a conversation to be had. As most of you are aware, setting up another corporation is time, is money, is another tax return, another audit, another annual general meeting. So you have to weigh the pros and cons of the administration versus the liability. I really, like I said before, I think the liability on advocacy is probably pretty low. So
Mm.
I'm not so concerned about it. I don't know, Dina,
The
before we
only,
segue, go ahead.
yeah, so advocacy, the only thing that you want to be mindful of is the hand that feeds you. So if you're pushing back against funders, right? And so being conscious of what do you want to stand up for, basically, and then the implications to the organization. So I love the question, and I would invite you to just do a quick risk assessment, right? So what are the benefits of me standing up as an advocate on behalf of something? What are the risks that I can see? What are the risks if I don't? Because that might actually give you a reason to stand up for something. And then what I always, always, always invite clients to do is pause and then do your communication plan. Who needs to know what, by when, how, and why are you doing this launch? Why are you communicating this? And if you pause and ask yourself the who needs to know what, by when, how, and why, it will force you to work through the chain of scenarios, and that is as a comprehensive kind of approach. So advocacy can come back and bite you in the butt. What I would really caution is that you're not just doing it because you're trying to hitch your star to the current theme of the day. Especially when it comes to human factors and people, you want to ensure that if you're actually going to stand up for Black people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, transgendered people, you better be ready to put your money where your mouth is. Hey, Steve? Like, people will sniff out if you're being disingenuous. So that would be we have cautionary tales of people trying to do that.
Yeah, and a lot of organizations are putting out press releases to support EDI and things like that. And really, I think, again, to your point, Dina, you have to be strategic. Some people are just coming out saying, we support EDI. That's probably not enough anymore. How? And some organizations have come out with the how. We are going to target minority newspapers. We are going to target advertising in minority places. We're going to partner up with new Immigrants to Canada organizations. Like there's a lot of really cool direct stuff to kind of to build on this.
Mm-hmm.
I want
Okay.
to
You want to go
segue.
to Marvin?
Yeah. Well, so Marvin's asked, are we getting a lot of queries about stakeholders pushing PSOs or NSOs to look for exemptions beyond the COVID restrictions? Short answer is absolutely yes. I actually had one yesterday where, and again, I kind of have to laugh at some of the stuff that comes across my desk. It was a 70-year-old man requesting a letter from their NSO to allow the United States to let them drive their car into the States because they're a high performance athlete. And, you know, no offense to the 70-year-old. And I
Master.
do know, yeah, he's a master's athlete, and is he better at the sport than I am? 100%. But was that something that their NSO was prepared to do? I mean, at the end of the day, absolutely not. It went through a bit of a risk assessment to say, okay, if we give him this letter and they do let him in and he catches COVID or gets injured, what's our responsibility because we promoted this type of travel? And that was a very big concern. I
Mm-hmm.
honestly believe, Marvin, that we in sport have to be the reasonable standard and sometimes the reality check. And again, I have, as most of you know, crazy stories. A couple months ago, pre-COVID, I guess it's a year ago now, but we had a woman, a 14-year-old athlete, have a concussion, and the organization properly put her through the concussion protocol, which required doctor's letters to move through each step. And when it was finally time to return to practice, the mother got a letter from an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor. And I have to give the eye doctor credit because what the letter said was, upon an examination of my patient's eyes, I do not see any concussion symptoms. And I was like, well, good for you for staying, in your expertise. And the organization had to go back to the mom and say, look, we appreciate, a letter from a doctor who specializes in eyes, but we would like somebody who has a little bit more skill set around concussion management. So sometimes we have to be the reality check.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think the expectations of getting kids back to play or just to be active is probably what needs to be good enough right now, particularly because of this cycle that we're on. I mean, there's already predictions of a third wave in March.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, well,
that,
that's great, Steve. And I would say just recently, Marvin, one of your PSOs, I was doing some work for them around some research that they conducted during the last wave of the pandemic to show that there was zero incidence of the spread, right, in terms of the cohorts. So we developed a communication plan around that. We were kind of like each other's thinking partners is what they called the experience. And then we're very clear about what was their role in trying to safeguard the experience between the athletes and the returning clubs and the facilities, the desire by people to return their kids to sport because of the mental health issues. A very real thing, and we haven't touched on it. I suspect we'll touch on it next month, Steve, more deeply, is I'm doing a lot of work in grief and loss. Thanatology is the word of the day. That's the study of grief and loss. I can share with you, I don't know how many times the word grief now comes up in regular conversations with people that say like they're just really grieving. They're grieving what they didn't get last year. They're grieving what they don't think they're going to get this year. The games are under real threat of not being played, and the experience is grief. That's the internal kind of response to this severed attachment that we have to dreams and identities and all this work we've put in, and plans don't get realized. And that's what we do as sport leaders. We are event managers and coaches and athletes, and we build our entire careers around the doing. So what happens when we can't do anymore? So if you're feeling blue and red, you have every right to feel that experience. So just to share, Marvin, I think it's really important for us to be showing confidence in the return to sport and being mindful that everybody's going to have a different risk tolerance. My advice always to clients is give the control back to the parents and then the participants. And then when you're back at the pool, just make it really clear, because you're going to, back to this, you're going to have those people that want to follow the rules. And then I'm seeing this a lot now, a lot of tension, Steve, between members of the national team, where you have the rule followers, the maskers, and then the anti-maskers, the pro-vaccinators and the anti-vaccinators. And then if you're not nourishing the relationship, you're going to have tension, and that tension will escalate to needless conflict unless you're nurturing a fuller perspective. So thank you, Marvin. Hopefully that helps address your point. And Steve, there's a really good comment here and question from Clarence. Did you want to take that one?
Yeah, totally. The proposal is to start separate leagues, one for trans and one for straight, as the trans community increases. As Dean, I'm going to play a little bit off, Dina, what you just said. We sometimes forget about the key stakeholder and the athlete. And I've said this comment a few times. I was an athlete for, I don't know, 20 years. And in that 20-year period, no one really asked me if I was having a good time or if there was anything that I would think could be done better to make me feel more comfortable or have a better experience. And I think we have to remember that. So, to Clarence's question, I would for sure engage the athlete and find out what makes sense for them. I think, to be honest with you, to segregate the league would be probably anti of what their expectations are, which is acceptance and inclusivity rather than separation. So I do see that. I don't see that as a viable option. And I don't think you'd have the numbers to do it right now, particularly across the sector. I will say a lot of sports are now starting to offer co-ed as an option. So I don't think, hey, we've started a trans league, that would be the first option. But again, I would talk to the athlete, see what makes them feel comfortable, and see what options are available to you. If you're in Toronto, maybe that's an option, but in Sudbury, it may not be. So I like getting feedback.
Hey, Steve, I just love the question and saying, hey, what might be a creative way for us to respond? And that one in particular, yeah, you can go play over there, may not be one, at least in the conversations I've had with people who identify on LGBTQ2+ and the trans community, that for at least the people I've been connecting with, that isn't what they're looking for. But it's not to say that we won't get to a place where more people want to feel like they can have meaningful competition, and get the benefits from sport in a safe, welcoming, and inclusive way. So the current structure now, we are feeling the limitations of our current structure. And as we start to wind down, Steve, one of the things that some of you were talking about here, and certainly Steve with his governance work, this idea of what would it look like if we really reimagined sport. We have a couple of blogs that one we wrote last year in December, but there was another one we wrote the year before. And what it's doing is inviting us to challenge ourselves into asking ourselves, are we structured optimally? If we were to design sport today, would we design it like a spaghetti mess on the wall? Where we have a board of directors up here, and then board of directors populated by well-meaning, passionate volunteers, and then the thousands of volunteers that are needed to populate the storefronts. What we know about our research, and if you're curious about that, you can go check that out. People far smarter than us are doing some really great research around trends around volunteering, and what does the next generation want to do? What are their volunteer aspirations and commitments? I can tell you, with the 3 kids I have that are in that cohort, they're more like one and done. They want to have an experience. So my 3 kids went to Nicaragua and built a school. That was their volunteer, and they were all in for a very focused period of time. Now they want to go and do something else. So the idea, sport was built on the lifeblood of committed volunteers who are the lifers. That way of volunteering isn't really what the next generation is signing up for. So then how are we going to run sport if the whole not-for-profit sector is based on an outdated and not sustainable model? And we won't even get into, the sad story of the Kielburgers and their experience and the pressure on not-for-profits to be at a standard that is just like a for-profit in terms of the requirements, right, Steve? In terms of really showing that you have financial controls in place and you have good bylaws in place and great policies and you're taking care of your people. For-profit, not-for-profit, organizations now have to be 21st century compliant. That's a lot to burden volunteers. Now we have a pandemic. So what is sport going to look like post-pandemic? I think we have some really interesting conversations to have.
I'm not sure where to take that, Dina, but I mean, I agree with you on, again, I just talk about setting up a corporation and what's become predominant again through the pandemic. This is a whole nother presentation about risk and liability returning in a COVID environment to a sporting world. We've discovered that there's a lot of organizations out there who are operating without a corporate veil, and that scares me. Back to your volunteer hat, where people are potentially exposing their personal assets because they're involved in decision making of an unincorporated entity. And so that's been really brought to the forefront during the pandemic, because a majority of us are going to go back into sport without COVID coverage. Now, BC and Ontario have passed legislation to mitigate that risk, or pretty much eliminate that risk, but the rest of the country, there's still that exposure. So setting up a corporation, it's actually really easy. It costs about $150 to do so, but it's the flip side of that. Annual general meeting, auditor, accounting, minutes, tax filings, etc. And, to your point, Dina, I think there's a lot of levels of bureaucracy in our world, and we might be able to eliminate some if there's an appetite to do that.
Yeah, beautiful. As we say, we prepare to say goodbye. One of the brilliant, actually he was brilliant, volunteers that I was speaking to around this whole reimagining, he started talking about fossil fuels and our reliance on fossil fuels. And I use that as an analogy in the reimagining part 2 conversation, because of our over-reliance on fossil fuels and our commitment to be a steward of the environment, we're now putting in place all kinds of new innovations, right? Electric cars and converting gas stations. So his point to me is, what is sports reliance on fossil fuel? What is our fossil fuel? And we got to a place where we thought our reliance on volunteerism, as a way of running and organizing sport, is probably our over-reliance on fossil fuels. So we'll leave you with that. So a couple of invitations from Stina. We're going to do this next month again, and what we would really love is send us your ideas. If there's things that you feel that we need to prepare, like as you can see, Steve and I kind of riff off each other. This is a great break for us. Otherwise, we're like heads down, working in our different silos. So it's so fun to be with all of you. If you have questions, let us know in advance, and that way maybe we can do some research on your behalf. You can send us an email at dbl@sportlaw.ca. Did somebody send in something? You're chuckling.
I'm worried now, Dina, because you might have said the word Stina. It could be trending on Twitter very shortly.
Let's hope. Well, as long as Steve is first, he's happy. So that's good. I don't even know what the opposite would be. Brangelina, right? It's our version of Brangelina. I love it. I like that you're first. So I'm going to finish with, so we're going to start next month. Our team is going to put that up. So let us know if you have specific things you want to talk about. We are going to be doing some blogs, so watch for those. And I thought I would end with this little poem. Because of the red and the blue, and just, for those of you who want to share, has your energy shifted? Send us a note. Let us know on here, or if you're inspired, send us an email, because we really care. I mean, that's part of our reason for being. We care about your health, and our whole mission is to help you achieve yours. So if there's things we can do to help support you, we really want to know. And I'd love to know whether or not your energy has shifted. So you can maybe send us a note and let us know. So this is a little poem by Mr. David White, a poet that I've been studying under since the pandemic started. And it's really nice. I'll just read a short little passage from it. It's the title is "Everything is Waiting for You." and I'm going to change the you to us. So everything is waiting for us. Our great mistake is to act the drama as if we were alone, as if life were a progressive and cunning crime, with no witness to the tiny hidden transgressions. To feel abandoned is to deny the intimacy of our surroundings. Put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. The kettle is singing even as we pour you a drink. The cooking pots have left their arrogant aloofness and seen the good in you at last. All the birds and creatures of the world are unutterably themselves. Everything, everything, everything is waiting for you. So hopefully something that we learned or shared, discovered about each other and this pandemic that we're in is bringing you a bit of comfort. It's always fun to hang out with Steve and all of you. So hopefully it's something that has served you here. Let us know what we can do better or differently next time. And don't see anything else here, Steve. So any last words before we say à demain, à bientôt, au revoir.
Thank you, everybody. Talk to you next time.
Bye.